Hey everyone, welcome on in. We typically wait until about 1 or 2 minutes after the official start time to actually get these webinars going, because you know how it is when your calendar app gives you a notification to go do something, you then have to rush to your proper device. The Zoom app probably has to update, and so we'd like to give people a little grace period of about a minute after we say we're going to start before we really hit the ground running here. But welcome on in. We're excited to have you. I know that for many people today actually was the first day of school, so that's exciting. Congratulations, any students in the audience who made it through the first day. Many more to come, and we're excited to work with you through the school year. One thing I do want to encourage everyone to do is throughout the time that we're giving the presentation today, please use the Q&A feature liberally. We will be answering questions, any questions you have about anything in the presentation at the end of the presentation. So we typically don't do the questions as we go, but instead handle them at the end of the presentation. If you already think you have a question and you're not sure if it's going to be addressed by the presentation today, then you can go ahead and drop that in the Q&A as well. Alyssa, how's it going?
It's going all right. We are knee-deep in essays and applications with our seniors at the moment. So that's always sort of a fun and exciting part of the year.
Very good. Very good times, yes.
Yes.
Juniors, that will be you in about a year in the throes of your application writing. So be very excited about that. Mostly excited that you have a year to breathe first.
Yes.
All right, so let's hop on into it now that the clock has struck 7:01 and we have given our stragglers a little bit of grace. So welcome on into our back to school webinar for juniors, everyone. Many of you know me. My name is Jim Wismer. I'm the director at Ivy Experience. I'm the one who often picks up the phone. And I speak with a lot of our new families about whatever they're interested in, but my specific expertise is more on the kind of test prep and tutoring side of the world. And I'm joined by my colleague, Alyssa Coltrane, our Assistant Director of College Admissions, who's more on the sort of holistic admissions side of things, working with our students on their applications and essays and kind of guiding them through that transition through junior year and into their actual college applications, all the way through to putting the deposit down at the school where they'll be attending. So
Yes.
we're very excited to have you.
Yes. At which point we'll still probably text you and say, congratulations. Did you put in your housing deposit yet?
The housing deposit reminders are generally welcome. Trust me. Parents who have
Yes.
been through the process once before can attest to that. Awesome. So if you've ever been to one of our webinars before, this slide will look mighty familiar. The kind of cornerstone of our advising philosophy is really that there are 5 factors that are in a student's control when it comes to college admissions. There are more than 5 factors that will come into play in your college admissions. So things like your demographic information and what other students at your school are doing, things like that, can all factor into eventually, your acceptances and denials. But students who really want to invest time and effort into improving their chances should be focused on these 5 areas. And so that's kind of the theme for the presentation tonight, is taking you through each of these 5 factors and guiding you along what you need to be thinking about at this time, junior year. So with that said, we'll jump into grades and rigor. And by rigor, what we mean is the level of your courses. So for instance, an AP course would be a higher level of rigor than a standard course. Now, rigor and grades are kind of together the most important of the 5 factors for college admissions. Many colleges are test optional. We see students get in without test scores. No one's GPA optional, right? So excellent grades are kind of to use a technical term, a sine qua non, a factor you can't do without. So junior year grades are typically considered the most important grades in high school. And this is for a very common sense reason. Students, you are more similar now as juniors to your college freshman self than you were when you were a sophomore or a freshman, right? And colleges know that. This is the last full year they get to see. That said, I do think it's important to say in a presentation like this that the grades at the beginning of senior year do count and colleges do see them. So if you apply early, whatever state those grades are in at the time that application is submitted is going to go to the college. If you apply for the regular deadline, they'll get an update before those decisions actually have to come in. So colleges will see those grades kind of through that first term of the year, whatever your school calls it, semester, trimester, term, whatever that term is, pun intended, sorry. Now, the other important thing to know about grades is that, grade inflation is a very serious problem. When I say problem, what I'm showing here is the percentage of freshmen at four-year colleges in the US who had at least a 90% equivalent GPA in high school. And we can see that that started in, around 21.8% at the beginning of our data set in 1966. And the most recent data covered by this study in 2022 showed that 80.6% of students had at least an A average. And so that's what I mean when I say grades are a sort of necessary but insufficient on their own condition for admission, especially to the more selective schools. So I have an example here of a school that tends to be popular with our students. A lot of our students are Pennsylvania-based, but not all of them. This is the University of Pittsburgh's main Pittsburgh campus. Now, I'll note that they use a weighted GPA, which means that you get an extra 0.25 in the GPA calculation for honors or AP courses. And with this weighted GPA system, 67% of their enrolled students had a GPA of over 4.0. And their average GPA for their most recently, this admitted class, so this class that started 2023 to 24, their average GPA was 4.13. The common data set is where we get this information. All schools put out data on the common data set. It's where we find out about average standardized test scores, average GPA, and various other factors like acceptance rate for a college. They published the prior year, and that's why the class that were freshmen in the 2023-2024 school year, that's the best that we have right now in terms of data, the most recent data that's publicly available for most schools. So these excellent grades are, again, going to be your most important kind of first step to a competitive college application. Now, grades and rigor, it's important to note that I'm not saying you're doomed if freshman and sophomore year didn't go as well as you would have liked them to, because colleges really do care about an improvement trajectory, meaning, a student who can show the ability to learn and grow. And, surprise, not everyone's totally mature when they show up at high school, when they're 14 or 15 years old and they're not quite ready for the rigors of a high school education. If you can bounce back from that and do better in your later years, then even if that GPA number isn't as high, that's going to read a lot better than if you had a lower GPA number, but it was steady throughout high school, or you had a lower GPA number and it actually had a downturn in the later years of high school. So remember that, nothing you've done so far is precluding anything. It's a matter of making sure that you're kind of doing the best you can with what you have available to you now and taking these opportunities during junior year to do your best work. Now, major specific grades are something that can also very much come into play. I would say this is true, especially in STEM fields, where, your math and science grades may be scrutinized more heavily than some of your grades in humanities courses. That said, when you're applying into some of the most competitive STEM schools in the country, they're going to care about everything because they have so little to kind of distinguish their very, very qualified applicants. So just keep in mind that if you find your performance slipping in a course that you believe is related to the major you eventually want to pursue, or majors you may eventually want to pursue, then that's something to address sooner rather than later. So what should we actually do about this fall? It's easy for me to sit here and say, well, why don't you all just go get perfect grades and then everyone will be happy, right? So I would say number one is consider last year's performance. Students typically struggle in similar domain areas from one year to the next. Has science been a consistent thorn in your side? Has it been English? Has it been math? Think about that and be proactive in this next year. Put some extra time to it. Think about getting a tutor, whatever you need to do, but consider last year and what you need to do to not, repeat any mistakes, or what you need to do to repeat anything you did really well from last year. Consider finals and any AP or IB exams. And I say this because every year some students reach out to us in April saying, hey, we have an AP exam next month. We'd like to get a 5. But the thing is, I've been getting a B all year. It's a lot easier to get a really strong score on that AP exam if you've been excelling in the course all year. The best AP prep is to just totally, kill it in that course all year. That's true for the IB as well. So I really recommend, trying to be proactive rather than reactive, especially in those very high level courses that most juniors are taking more of than they have in the past. The better you learn along the way, the less work you're going to have this spring. And so it's often a lot less work to intervene early and invest a little bit more early than to reach out late. I recommend, as first steps in a situation where a student's struggling, reach out to your teacher for assistance. A lot of teachers make themselves available during their free periods, during lunch, after or before school, for extra guidance in their subject matter, and they really enjoy that mentorship. It's also a nice way to build the relationships that will eventually lead to letters of recommendation. More on that in a bit. And I also recommend reaching out to your peers to form study groups. I've been a giant nerd my whole life. That's how you become a standardized testing professional, shockingly, I know. But my favorite way to study in high school was to teach the material to my friends. I've been tutoring since 8th grade. And for me, that was the best way to study for the test. I remember, this was back before video chat was an option, students, but a friend of mine called me before our honors biology exam in 9th grade. He's like, I got 4 hours. I need you to teach me everything you know about biology. He's now a doctor, by the way. He came a long way. We're really proud of him. But the point is, reaching out to your friends, you can benefit them as well. Don't feel like you're pulling them back. Giving is getting when it comes to study. Teaching something's a great way to learn. And I would say if you're the one excelling, reaching out to your friends can be a great way to turn something that might feel like a chore into more of a social, interactive, fun thing. Not that studying biology is the most fun thing in the world, but doing it with friends is a lot nicer than locking yourself in a closet and doing it on your own. So if those kind of interventions fail and you're looking at tutoring, then I would say the main things we're going to focus on if you're working with us on tutoring are, of course, content review and making sure you understand the material is paramount. But we also really want to focus on study skills and forming habits that are going to help you be successful when you're not working with the tutor anymore. Things that are going to be consistently reliable for you to learn new information and integrate it in that course. We focus on test taking strategies, even when it's not test prep. And that means, we want to look at how are you actually being evaluated in this course. If you're writing essays on your tests, we need to practice that kind of essay. If it's multiple choice, maybe we need to talk about some multiple choice strategies. We want to, make sure that you're ready to give that information back in the way that it's going to be expected from you. And so when we're preparing for an exam for a course, whether that's just a unit test in math or something like an AP exam at the end of the year, then we're going to focus on, do we need to master the form of the test? If any of you are taking AP US history this year, you're going to learn a lot about document-based questions, and there's an art to writing the document-based question. Is that what we need to focus on? Or do we need to know, our dates better? And so focusing on that content is another thing we'll do, depending on the situation. Either way, again, sooner is better than later for these academic interventions, because our phones ring off the hook once everyone gets their first test back in early October. And if you make the intervention before that test comes back in early October, it's a lot easier to have a strong first marking period grade.
So we often put letters of recommendation here, not just to give everyone a little bit of a break from the sheer amount of numbers that are coming once I hand this back to Jim and let him talk about standardized tests, but also because letters of recommendation in some ways follow directly from the relationships that you are building with teachers over the course of, ideally getting those good grades in those high rigor classes. And it's helpful because it allows us to sort of speak to one of the misconceptions of about recommendation letters, which is about sort of what they show. They're not just about showing, oh, I got an A in my math class. Your transcript shows that. But it allows teachers to speak to sort of the soft skills that you have in the classroom. Not just, did you get the A, but were you the student who started the study group with their friends and helped teach them? Were you the student who showed up and asked extra questions? Were you attentive and engaged? Did you go the extra mile with the material? And that is sort of what makes for a really strong letter of recommendation. So to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of this, juniors, you are in prime letter of recommendation season. The teachers you are meeting or about to meet now will likely be the teachers who write letters of recommendation for you later on in this process. Ideally, for letters of recommendation, you're going to identify 1 or 2 junior year core subject teachers. For universities, core subject means, of course, math, science, English, social sciences, but that can also mean a foreign language, as well as your counselor. And this is something that families often overlook. Build a relationship with your counselor now so they can write a recommendation that serves you well. And we always have families who occasionally ask us, like, can I ask my English teacher, even if I got that B? And in this case, you're going to want to ask the people who know you and who love you and who are going to be able to speak to more than just, well, this student got an A in my class, but going above and beyond that. The other question we often get is about optional other recommenders. Some colleges do allow applicants to submit additional letters of recommendation, a second or a third. We don't recommend that unless there is something in that letter, in that relationship, which wouldn't show up anywhere else on your application, which illustrates another facet of you as an applicant. And I think, Jim, you had a story about that, right? You used one of
Yeah,
those
that's
optional
right.
letters?
I did, yeah. So as one of my recommenders, I chose my 9th grade social studies teacher, and it's relatively rare to choose a 9th grade teacher to write a letter of recommendation. But he was also my head track and field coach. Now, track and field was my main event, my main extracurricular activity in high school. But I was a late bloomer physically, and so at college application time, it just said JV, JV, JV. I ended up being the team captain in the spring of senior year. It's a spring sport. Would have been nice if it was a fall sport. It would have counted a little bit more. But the point is, I put a lot of time into track and field, and I was sort of a leader on the team, even though I just wasn't scoring points in meets. And I was doing things like running the timing system for the coach. I was actually our shot put and discus coach one season because they couldn't find a coach, and so they just let me coach the other students. And these are things that if I say them about myself, a college has to take it with a grain of salt. But I knew that my head track and field coach, who was also my social studies teacher, by the way, I was going to study, among other things, philosophy and classics, both heavily related to social studies. So because it was a teacher in a domain area that was related to my majors, and it was also someone who could uniquely speak to my involvement in this extracurricular activity that looked really like nothing on paper. That's kind of the unique insight that an optional recommender can add that can make sense. If it's just another teacher saying, really conscientious student, did a great job, got an A, the A is already on your transcript. So that's kind of the situation where it could make sense to add another.
So, as I mentioned, we are in prime letter of recommendation season, but it is not at the point where you need to be asking teachers now, settle into your classes, get good grades, start to develop these relationships. But do make an effort to ask the teachers that you'd like to have write a letter for you before the end of junior year. So, sometime after spring break, reach out to these teachers. And the reason why you ask them is both for their sake and for you. Teachers get a ton, especially the popular teachers. I ended up actually missing out on a letter of recommendation from my social studies teacher because I waited, and he then was writing 80 letters and went, Alyssa, I'm so sorry. Especially very popular teachers will sometimes cap the number of letters that they write for a letter of recommendation. They do this in order to ensure that they are able to write the best letter of recommendation that they possibly can. And they often use the summer to do this. So by asking early, you're giving yourself a better chance of having that teacher be willing to write a letter of recommendation for you. But it also gives them the most amount of time possible to be able to write write you that letter of recommendation. So you ask in the spring, if you have not heard from, your teacher by late summer or fall, if we have any seniors who happened into this webinar, this might be the moment to reach out to your writers and politely remind and thank them, just to make sure that this is still on their radar. When it comes to how, this is one of those components of making sure your letter doesn't fall off the teacher's radar. You want to ask in person. This is someone that you've hopefully built a relationship with over the course of the semester. You've shown up to, their free periods, you've asked those questions, you've built those relationships. This is also a personal moment. Ask in person, but then follow up with an email. And the reason why you do that is so that the teacher has a written paper trail to help them remember that they've agreed to do this, but it also gives you an opportunity to remind them of any deadlines that might be coming up. If you're applying early decision or early action somewhere, those deadlines are earlier than regular decision applications, but also express some of the reasons why you chose that teacher and what you hope they might highlight in a letter of recommendation. If you did a stunning presentation on the Spanish Civil War, where the teacher went, I actually need to reconsider my take on this particular thing afterwards, gently remind them of that, because they do want to write you the best letter they possibly can. Having a reminder when they are writing 80 letters of recommendation can help them help you. All right. And then having give you all a brief reprieve from numbers. Jim, all yours.
Here we go. So I think with the conversation that has been going on around standardized testing recently, I find it very useful at the beginning of this part of the conversation to start by just backing up and saying, why do colleges use it at all? Because they've started using it differently than they have in the past. So what is the point? Standardized testing is the single best predictor of student success at a college. Student success is typically defined by things like your freshman year GPA, and then also, your probability of actually graduating from that college and doing so in 4 years, if that's a priority of that institution, which for most selective schools it is, but not necessarily everywhere. Shout out to Westchester. Then it also helps colleges to compare you with your local context. So when I say that, what I mean is colleges get with your transcript something called a school profile for your high school. And that will include information like the average SAT or ACT score from your high school. So that helps them see, compared to peers of a similar background, how you performed on standardized testing. Finally, it's really important to remember that this always has been part of a holistic review process. And that means no one actually believes that standardized testing, that a standardized test score can tell you who someone is. That a standardized testing is even the most important part of this process, because it's not. It is one factor in a holistic review process. And I'm going to talk through kind of how colleges view it and how it's important. So the biggest difference between this presentation now and in past years is I mostly talk to families who understand what test optional means now. When test optional first came around, I got a lot of calls like, well, I heard standardized testing doesn't matter anymore. I heard colleges aren't looking at it anymore. And of course, every news outlet that wanted to, gain clicks, as is the way of the world, was saying things like, college eliminates requirement for testing. Of course, eliminates requirement doesn't mean that it's not important or doesn't help you. It just means they'll take your application fee and process your application with or without a test score. But we've seen more people high up in the admissions world going on the record about scores and their usefulness. And we've seen kind of more schools go back to requiring schools. And while the vast majority of colleges are still test optional, there are, when it comes down to really, 3 policies to keep in mind. Test optional is most places. Test required includes many of the large southern state schools and many of the most selective schools in the country. So that would include half of the Ivy League went back to requiring tests just this past spring. It also includes MIT and Georgetown. And then there are colleges that are test blind or score free. This is mostly a West Coast phenomenon. But the University of California system is the most popular among our students. So if you're interested in UCLA or Berkeley or anything out west, then it's possible you'll be applying to some colleges that don't use scores at all. Test optional, though, is an umbrella policy. And what I mean by that is, again, test optional just means you can apply with or without the test score. It doesn't tell you anything about your likelihood of success. And so you have some test optional colleges like Duke, Penn, and the University of Texas who are admitting over 70% with test scores. University of Texas went back to requiring scores. So I'm sorry I left that in the slide. Then you also have some other colleges that admit fewer than 30% of their students with test scores, like University of Washington and Pepperdine. You might notice a trend that test scores are generally considered less important on the West Coast. And that is generally true, but not universally. The bottom line when it comes to test optional, and I don't want to bludgeon this point, but essentially, if you have a strong score, it's still going to help you. The more selective your college goals are, and particularly if you're applying to some of these schools with a less than 15% admissions rate, the more important it is to have a test score, because you need every little bit to separate yourself from the other applicants when you're applying to those most selective schools in the country. Having a strong score will expand your options for both college choice, because you have a much better chance at some of the not so test optional schools, and you also are able to apply to the test required schools. And merit scholarships. There are many places that are test optional for admissions, but they require scores for scholarships. And this is the final point, but it is important. If obtaining a strong standardized test score would require an undue amount of time and effort on your part, there are still plenty of excellent test optional colleges out there that you can apply to and have a strong chance without a test score. So I do want to say that, but for students who are, aiming for some of the most selective scores in the country, which if you're at our webinar at Back to School Time is often the case, then it really behooves you to try to make a plan to get that very strong test score. Now, these are the test dates. I've highlighted senior year here just because you should know that for early action and early decision deadlines, for which most of our students will apply, the last time you can take the SAT or ACT is October for the SAT and September for the ACT. This is a year from now. So you're not up against any kind of time limit yet. But I do like to just point this out because when you're talking about making a plan for standardized testing, understanding your sort of last option is helpful. December is the last one that's available for the regular deadlines if you're applying for regular deadlines. One of the classic questions we get about the test is like, oh, well, my neighbor told me that the, February test has an easier curve or whatever. The common version is like the fall test dates have a harder curve because the seniors take them too. The thing is that the curves of the SAT and ACT are hypothetical. They're not based on the students who actually tested that day. So it's not like the curve from your college calculus class where, one person sitting in that room got an A, right? And most people got C's. It doesn't work like that. There are test dates that have easier or harder curves, but that's to adjust for actual difficulty differences in the test. And certainly there are curves that work better for a student or worse for a student. And there's also just natural variation in the test. Maybe there were, 2 fewer vocab questions than usual, and vocab's a weakness of yours. That's going to work in your favor regardless of how the curve is. So there's variance test to test, but you have no way of knowing before you sit down for that test if that's going to be like a favorable test date for you or not. Now, you have 2 options for standardized testing, the SAT and the ACT. The SAT is now digital, so any of our parents who have a student who is a college freshman or older would have prepared for a different version of the SAT than the current one. The current one can only be taken on a computer. And it is broken down into 2 reading and writing modules and 2 math modules. Those 2 sections are scored out of 800. You get an overall score out of 1600. The biggest challenge of the digital SAT relative to the ACT, I would say, is number one, that the verbal questions are more challenging. You're going to have questions about poetry, questions about passages from the 1800s. You have limited annotation tools on the test as well. It's a digital interface only. So essentially that means that you can only annotate as the application allows. Whereas on a paper test with a good old fashioned Dixon Ticonderoga, and of course I have one next to me, you can do whatever you want to that test, right? Finally, adaptive scoring is often considered a challenge by our students. Adaptive scoring on this test is not necessarily a challenge so much as a mental obstacle for students, because the fact that it is adaptive messes with their heads. But here is essentially how SAT scoring works. Your first module, whether it be for math or reading and writing, is of the same difficulty level as everyone else who took the test. Then, based on your performance in that first module, you're fed either into a harder second module or an easier second module. And that harder second module is necessary to access the scores at the very top end. And you're going to be fed into a sort of lower part of the curve from that easier second module. Your scores can overlap between what's possible from the easier and harder second modules. And that's why we've kind of represented this with a color gradient, because it's not like you're locked into a set range. It does still matter what questions you missed. Questions have variable weights on this version of the test, which is unlike the ACT. And so, in other words, the sort of black boxiness of the SAT scoring algorithm now, I think, can sometimes mess with students' heads, even though it's a bit of a distinction without a difference, because on the original SAT, or rather the one that students were taking 2 years ago, if you missed half of the questions in the first half of the test, you were already locked into a lower score range. So the fact that the module ends and spits you into a new module, it's not really anything new, in the sense that if you missed that many questions, you were still going to get a score that was lower than if you got them right, which on this test puts you into the harder second module. So I think that's important to realize. And it's the reason that the SAT can now be shorter, because they can keep a level of accuracy while shrinking the test down like this. The ACT situation right now is a little more complicated. They've announced changes to the ACT. Now, this is where the rumor mill has really picked up, because I've been hearing from parents on the phone, oh, well, didn't they get rid of the science section? I heard that if I wait until April, I don't have to take the science section. Here's the deal with ACT science. They're making it optional. ACT is making it optional. No college has said that it's optional. And what I mean by that is no college has come out and said, we prefer scores with ACT science or without. So we don't know how colleges' policies are actually going to shake out on this. We have one data point for policy. So listen up, any Florida families in here. The Bright Futures Scholarship in Florida, which is something we work with countless students for, because it is a test score and GPA based scholarship. It's numerical. So if we get to a certain number, we get a certain amount of money. We love the Bright Futures Scholarship with our Florida families. We love making people money on scholarships. And so the Bright Futures Scholarship has said that they are requiring ACT science. And that's the only policy data point we have. It could be that every other college in the country says, you know what, we don't even want the science score. In that case, sure, take it without science. But until we hear from colleges, it's my advice that every student should be taking the ACT with the science section. The classic ACT had 4 sections. English and reading map pretty closely to the reading and writing section of the SAT. And then, of course, they split math into math and science. The new version is just going to have English, math, and reading as the core test, with science as an optional section. I haven't said anything about writing yet, and that's on purpose because no one requires ACT writing. It used to be that only West Point did, and they actually got rid of the requirement in the last year. So I see no reason that any student should ever sign up for ACT writing. If you think you have a situation where I might be wrong about that, I'd be very curious to hear about it. But my advice is don't worry about the writing section. That is truly optional and colleges don't care about it. Science, though, we don't know if it's actually optional or not. ACT is just allowing you to sign up with or without it. The scoring of the ACT is out of 36. If you're used to SAT scoring, it is quite different. It's especially different because your section scores are all out of 36, and your overall score out of 36 is an average of those section scores. So the way it'll work with the new version is you'll get an average of these 3 sections, English, math, and reading, and that will be your score out of 36. Then science will be reported as a separate score out of 36. I know this is a little bit confusing. I would say overall, the challenges of the ACT relative to the SAT are time. The ACT is harder to finish on time than the SAT. Now, the new version of the test, they're addressing that. They're going to give students more time per question. And if you're interested in some of the technical details on the new ACT, we did a webinar on it earlier this summer. We send out after each webinar a link to the recording to all of the registrants to the webinar. So I'll throw in the recording to the ACT webinar. I don't want to take up too much time with that tonight. If you're curious about how this kind of impacts your testing plan, let's talk about it. QR code in the corner. You can set up a 15-minute call with me to talk about your test prep plan anytime. The big picture of how to make a test prep plan, though, is pretty straightforward. You try an SAT and you try an ACT and you compare the scores. If one of the 2 tests ends up being much stronger than the other, then prepare for and take the one that's stronger than the other. If the scores are similar, then you look at, where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses. If it's a true tie, what test dates work better for me? What did I like better? The best time to get this diagnostic testing done is by the end of 10th grade. And I say that not to, freak anyone out, but just that is when we typically recommend doing it, especially if you're on an earlier timeline. The beginning of 11th grade is still a really great time to do it, especially if you're taking Algebra 2 this school year. We offer free remote diagnostic ACT and SAT testing to anyone. We're going to include it in the recap email from this presentation. So we'll give a test recommendation, feedback on your performance, and then we offer a plan to set up, or rather a call to set up a test prep plan. You're not obligated to work with us and you don't pay anything for the diagnostic test. But I recommend definitely doing this, whether with us or another company, because this is the way to make sure you're making the right test choice for you. People often ask me at this point, well, wouldn't it be better to just take both? If you want to take both, there's no harm in taking both. You should, if you're investing time and money into test prep, you should focus that investment in one direction for maximum return. I mean, we view test prep as an investment, right? It's your family's money, it's your child's time and effort and energy, a little bit of everyone's stress, and that's supposed to yield a stronger result in the end. So we want that investment to yield as much as possible, because that stronger result in the end yields potential scholarship money, yields more college options. And so, I really recommend focusing your investment in test prep in one direction for best results. I will say the students who kind of benefit the most from taking both tests are the high scorers who just need to have their best day on the right day. With that, I'll hand it over to Alyssa to free you from the tyranny of standardized testing and talk about fun stuff to do instead.
Yes, so I'll be taking you through the last handful of our factors. At this point, we're moving primarily into the qualitative factors. We had a little bit of a preview of that with letters of recommendation, but these are the places where students have the opportunity to sort of showcase who they are outside of the sort of quantitative academic numbers of grades, of rigor of an SAT or ACT score. And in some ways, they can almost become a little more confusing and a little more anxiety producing because it's much harder to go, well, the number went up and then that is good. For extracurricular activities, colleges are looking to see that students are sort of productive and pursuing their interests in their spare time. There is not a secret sauce. There is not a checkbox of we need to see students doing a sport, a volunteer activity, a passion project, a artistic hobby. Admissions officers are people, they have their own interests. They are looking to accept a class full of people with their own specific interests as well. So we encourage students to explore your interests rather than simply focusing on what seems impressive. Extracurricular activities in many ways are as as key to sort of your personal growth as they are for college applications. And for juniors, you've likely done a lot of this work already. You've hopefully explored activities in 9th and 10th grade. You've started to discover what it is that you're actively interested and engaged with doing. And we would encourage you to continue to do that. Being authentic is both best for your personal development, and it also has the incidental strategic application of making your application look consistent. If you're interested in baseball and you also volunteer with Challenger Baseball, for instance, that makes sense to an admissions officer and allows you to keep doing what you love, play baseball in a variety of different ways. That being said, if you discover next year that you actually really love crochet, that's fine too. Like, we encourage you to explore as many interests as possible. So what does that look like as we're going into, the late summer, early fall of junior year? That looks like building on things that you're already doing. Instead of joining new clubs, consider pursuing depth rather than breadth. Apply for a leadership position in a club that you're already in. Consider taking on a project for, an organization that you love, but you're not limited to school-sponsored activities. If we're going to run with the baseball analogy here, if you are an absolute fanatic with a PH, of course, and you want to get into, the statistics and the nitty-gritty of it, start your own podcast. Run a fantasy baseball league and have the ante go towards charity. There are many different ways to engage thoughtfully and deeply that aren't necessarily limited to what you're doing in school, and those are going to be more fulfilling for you and also, show up and look good on a college application. And you also want to be looking towards next summer, especially for students who are thinking about internships or summer programs. Ponder what you want to do with that. Many application deadlines for summer programs are surprisingly early. They're in November or December of this year for for competitive summer programs. So it's something to start thinking about and having conversations about already. And it also gives you a chance to, if they're on college campuses, do a little bit of visiting, because that is something else that you can start doing in your junior year. The college list is something that we sometimes call the sixth factor to college admissions, because although there are 5 factors that affect your acceptance to a given school or university, your college list ultimately affects the range of acceptances that you get to a range of colleges and universities. So thinking about building that list carefully is also a really crucial part of that. And thinking carefully can be important because there are 3,948 degree granting institutions in the United States. See, Jim, I can do numbers too. You have to limit that somehow. Especially for majors that are a little bit more common. If you're looking to study business, biology, computer science, many institutions have those programs. If you want to do marine biology or be a pilot, call me. I have your list already made up for you. But for broader majors, it's okay to be superficial. You're choosing not just a place where you're going to take classes for 4 years, but you're also choosing a home. Do you want warm weather, cold weather? Does it matter to you that there is a Starbucks on campus? All of these things add up into something that we like to call the match and fit for a school. And that's going to fit into 4 factors. And I'm going to talk about our third one first here, financial. College is expensive. Having that conversation early as a family can be helpful. It helps shape the rest of the list. Going, what are our priorities? What can we afford? How are we going to handle this? Help shape the list going forward. Other aspects of match and fit can be physical. Like I said earlier, do you want a big school, a small school, warm weather, cold weather? If you're studying marine biology, are you near an ocean so you can do that? Social, does it have the sort of atmosphere you're looking for? I went to a very tiny liberal arts college where the best thing to do on a Friday night was to sit in the science building auditorium and watch anime. I loved it. It was probably not the best fit for a student who perhaps wanted to be going to college football games instead. And then, of course, there is those academic factors. Does the college offer what it is you want to study? If you're unsure of what you want to study, does it offer a range? Is it easy to transfer from one school to another? All of these are things that you want to take into consideration, as well as, of course, your likelihood of getting in. And Jim, I see numbers. I'm going to let you do this one.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that the Common Data Set is a series of information put out by colleges about their average grades and test scores and things like that. And so often you see a mid-range of test scores, and we colloquially call this the middle 50%. So the middle 50% of students, submit between this test score and this test score. It's just the 25th and 75th percentile of their admitted class. Now, one thing about middle 50% ranges is that in a test optional world, they are the middle 50% of the top half of scores, on average, rather. The score submission rate is, of course, going to be different everywhere. But that score submission rate, by the way, is actually also in the Common Data Set. So we can see, if we're looking at a school like, Penn State, it's about 50% of their students submit test scores. I think it's actually a little closer to 40, and Pitts is a little closer to 60, just to give 2 Pennsylvania examples. And so then if you look at a school like Florida State, their middle 50% is actually the truth, because 100% of students need to submit test scores. So understanding what the middle 50% is an important thing here. It's going to be different at schools that are test optional. It's going to be different based on how test optional they are. But in general, if you're in that middle 50%, we consider it a target school. If you're above that, we consider it a likely school. And if you are, so if you're above that, we consider it a likely school. If you're below that, we consider it a reach school. I got mixed up for a second. And so this isn't universally true. I think the main thing is, even if you're above the test score distribution at a college with a single digit acceptance rate, that's not a likely school for anyone, right? So that's something to keep in mind, but that's roughly speaking how to interpret the kind of data when you look up a school's average test score and what that means for your admission chances. So we have a bit of an example here this is from the University of Wisconsin, a school that's become a lot more popular with our students over the past few years. So their middle 50% for test scores is between 1370 and 1490. And they, by the way, have a submission rate of 54%. I didn't put that on the slide. And I'll just speak in SAT terms for this example. Their average GPA is 3.9 out of 4.0. That is not weighted. And then their acceptance rate is 45.9%. Now, bear in mind, University of Wisconsin is a state school in the state of Wisconsin, and that acceptance rate in the state of Wisconsin is going to be higher than out. So as an out-of-state applicant to Wisconsin, your acceptance rate is lower than this. You might look at this and think it looks kind of juicy, almost 50%. Okay. That's a popular school, but it is less for out-of-state applicants, generally speaking. So student A here with a 15.4 and a 4.2 GPA would generally consider this a likely school. Student B, who's right at the averages, would consider it a target school. And student C, who's below those averages, would generally consider it a reach school. There are other factors at play here too, if you have a lights out extracurricular record and things like that. And there are schools at which that would be more or less important, but that's kind of generally how to understand this concept of target, reach, and likely, especially in the preliminary rounds of doing this research.
And I want to pause here a little bit and talk about the category of school which is often the least popular, but I think the most crucial is the likely schools. Jim and I actually both ended up going to our likely schools. These are the schools where a student's GPA or test scores are at or above the 75th percentile. Schools that have, more than that 15-20% acceptance rate. And we encourage families to really have at least 2 or 3 of these schools where the student would truly be able to study what they want to study and would be happy going there. It is one of the ways to take pressure off in this process. For many students, likely schools are often rolling admission schools as well, so you can hear back from a school, have an acceptance in your pocket, know you're headed somewhere. But it also has hidden possibilities of merit scholarships and honors colleges that can make these likely schools end up being really attractive options where you go, I could get, a great education for a lot less than some of my targets or my reach schools, or I'm going to get a chance to work one-on-one with professors at a R1 research university that I might not be able to do if I weren't, for instance, in the honors college. So this is something to really spend some time digging into, work on identifying these, as well as, of course, the targets and reaches. When it comes to the question of how many, you'll often hear it's important to have that, that balanced list. As I've said before, we really encourage our students to have 2 to 3 likely schools that they'd be sincerely happy at. But ultimately, after this, the composition of a student's college list is going to be up to them and their family. If you have a list that is 3 likelies and a lot of reach schools, it may mean you get told no more often than you get told yes, and that can be hard, especially in March and April when regular decision starts coming back. Having a selection of targets can give you more options, but we also encourage students to consider the amount of work required to apply, not just the number of schools. You can have a a 10-school list and write 3 supplement essays. You can have a 10-school list and write 30 supplement essays, depending on the school. So it's something to keep in mind as you are building the list. How many essays am I actually going to have to write? And since we're highlighting the essays that you may or may not have to write, depending on the school, we're going to wrap up our final and my favorite factor of our 5 by wrapping up with college essays. In case anyone wondered, my PhD is not in math, but in fact in English and literature. So there is no good time to write college essays. Students are always going to be busy. There is always going to be a perfect summer day when you might perhaps rather be at the Jersey Shore. There is always going to be a test to study for. There is only the least worst time to write college essays, and that is, in many ways, starting early so that you can find a balance between getting your applications done and studying for the test, spending that weekend down the shore, getting sleep, doing your extracurriculars, all of the other things that you are competing and balancing your time. That's taking full advantage of junior year. We work with students starting in November of their junior year, and we piecemeal out components. We work gradually so that things are never overwhelming, and then we really launch into, getting things done the summer between junior and senior year, which means this process isn't overwhelming because we plan ahead. Ideally, most of your essay and application work will be done by the time senior year starts. And especially for the Common App, that's something you can start doing. The Common App prompts release usually around January or February of every year, so they are technically not out yet. But that being said, the Common App has added exactly 1 prompt in 6 years. You can start brainstorming ahead of time. When it comes to those college essays, there is a series of essays a student might have to write. The first and most important is going to be the personal statement or the Common App essay. It is the essay that students will send to nearly every college or university that they choose to apply to, with the University of California system as a notable exception. This is the heart and soul of the application. It's the only chance students have to talk directly to an admissions officer in their own voice about who they are as a person. After that, schools will ask their own specific questions. Some of the most common are, why this college, or why your major? Why do you want to study biology at the University of Wisconsin? Why do you want to study computer science at Michigan? Community and diversity essays, which ask students to talk about elements of their lived experience, how they would bring those to campus, communities they belong to, and how those communities have affected them. To expand on those most important activities, what have you spent your time doing in your extracurriculars and outside of the classroom? And then there's just sort of miscellaneous fun ones. University of Vermont asked what kind of ice cream would you be and why, which is always a fun one to work on. But often savvy students who start early are able to write and repurpose from these first 3 categories, and then they can linger on, thinking about what ice cream they are. As we start the brainstorming process, and this is going to be primarily for the personal statement, but it speaks to almost every essay that we discussed. Ideas are going to come from 2 places. They, of course, will come from a student's resume, their activities, their jobs, their skills, volunteering that they've done. But these are all things that will likely show up in the application somewhere else. often the strongest essays are going to come from the toast topics. And we call them toast topics not because sliced bread isn't fantastic, it is, but because these are the things someone would speak about if they were to stand up at a dinner and give a toast to a student. No one is going to stand up and go, here's to Jim who got an A in his AP Science class. I'm sure you did get A's in all of your AP Science classes, Jim. But they're going to speak about, you know, here's to the person who knows all of their friends' favorite cake recipes and shows up and bakes them on their birthdays, even when some of those friends like pineapple upside down cake, which is gross. They're going to
Alyssa
go,
switched from talking about me to talking about herself really quickly.
yeah. It's going to be about here's to, you know, it's going to be about hobbies, about experiences, about shared moments and traditions. And this is the moment, the reason why we ask students to truly tell us everything we need to know about them. Favorite colors, weird family nicknames, all of those things, because they help us get to know the student and generate an essay that is distinct and unique to them. We also often get asked, all right, well, but there are bad essay topics, right? And in some ways, yes, these are often going to be, you know, cliched topics. The sports essay, the camp essay. These are going to be potentially controversial topics. These are going to be essays where the student is venting about another person, sibling rivalries, breakup stories. And these are often because they are either not distinct or they're not about the student in many ways. If you are writing about your political beliefs, then you're writing about your political beliefs rather than writing about yourself. If you're writing about, you know, a sibling rivalry, are you writing too much about your sibling and not enough about yourself? But sometimes it can be topics that are simply not distinct enough. And Jim, you had one about that, right? And this time
Oh
it
yeah,
will turn
so
your
my
sister under the bus, right?
yeah, my younger sister, she was a state champion track and field athlete, and instead of writing about that for her college essay, she wrote about taking care of her family's cats. And so the point is, you know, winning a state championship in track and field, it's already in the activity section of the application. She gets full credit for that incredible accomplishment. You know, she's got multiple years of varsity letters to speak to that. She's got lots of medals and awards, and she's getting credit for all those in the college's eyes already. She doesn't need to waste the space where she becomes a human being on, you know, being a track and field robot, so to speak.
We actually had a student who literally climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, and we told him that he wasn't writing his personal statement about it. And he wrote about playing in a band and what he'd learned from, you know, each of his different band members, and like learned how to play slap bass and also how to be patient from one of them. And it ended up serving him really well in the process because it spoke about him in a way that, you know, Mount Kilimanjaro did not. And that, in a sense, leads me to this idea that in some ways it's not what you say, it's how you say it. I just called out sports and camp, for instance. There are good and bad topics, but it is about how you approach those topics. They are not so much tired topics as tired narratives. There are good essays about volunteering, athletics, dance, but they need to be specifically personal. You know, don't tell me that you tried really hard on your soccer team and, you know, you practiced really hard and then you won the big game, or you didn't. And then you realized that it was actually about trying really hard anyway. Tell me about the specific position you play in soccer. and how that lets you see the entire field from a distance, and that you realize that that's how you like to approach all of the problems in your life. You take that step back and you survey the entire field before you act. Tell me something specific about you. It's not the topic that's tired, it's the narrative that often goes with the topic. And the final question, what prompt do we use? Prompt 7 is submit a topic, an essay on a topic of your choice. If it doesn't fit in any of those, the first 6, put it there. Admissions officers are looking to get to know students, who they are, their personalities, what makes them tick, who they're going to be on campus. And that's what, when we work with students, we really work to highlight. Because we do coach students from the essay process, from the very beginning through the very end. We start with brainstorming, we get to know them, their hobbies, their traditions, their favorite color, that funny story that happened in 10th grade with kayak. And we help package them, not just with a personal statement, but every other piece of the application so that every single story gets told. Once we have the right idea, we work with them on unlimited drafts and support while still letting them write the essays in their own voice, because that is the most crucial part of this process. Admissions officers are people. They're looking to get to know and admit a class full of people. The best thing any student can do is, well, start early and write in your own voice, and that's something that we go out of our way to assist students in this process.
So we've dumped a lot on you for the very beginning of junior year, especially as relates to college, right? And so I wanted to give some, specific tips on how to have conversations about this stuff as a family in a way that's productive. One thing that I've seen work very well in the past is to set a day and time each week for college conversations. We talk about college, we can do it during dinner on Tuesday. But we can't just have, mom turn every ride home from soccer practice into, oh no, I'm trapped in the car for 15 minutes of college conversation, because that's going to build resentment over the course of a year. Or we can't have students squirreling their way out of the conversation every time because it's not the right time to talk about it. Instead, just, let's set a boundary early that everyone agrees to, and that's when we can talk about it. And our relationship is our relationship outside of that. It works very well for some families. Also, it's important to remember that students and parents both have unique insights into this process. Students, as I like to remind you, your parents are a lot more similar to admissions officers than you are. And so they bring a perspective to this that is important. But of course, students, no one knows you better than yourself, right? And the way that you represent yourself on this application has to be something that you support at the end of the day. Parents also have insight into things like finances that a student wouldn't be able to necessarily understand. Whereas a student has, insight into what they actually want in college that a parent can't necessarily know. Be upfront about finances and other limitations. We already talked about that, but having those conversations before a student falls in love with a school that could never be a real option is much better than having the conversation after. And then finally, be realistic about the level of urgency. When it comes to college selection at this time in the year, there is none, right? If it's this time next year and we don't have a very well-defined college list, there's a different level of urgency that these conversations need to take. And so remember that, starting these conversations early is about making it easier and less stressful, not about front loading and making it so stressful right now. Thank you everyone so much for joining. We are going to put this on YouTube. We are going to send it out to everyone who registered, not just the attendees, and then feel free to share that link with everyone. We do have time for a Q&A though, so we're going to go ahead and go through those questions. All right. So we start with question 1. My son tested early per your recommendation for the ACT. His worst section was the science segment. Do you think it is important for him to retest in the spring when science is optional? I believe I answered this in the course of the presentation, but it is important that he wait to see if colleges will accept ACT scores without science involved, before he make that decision. So I wouldn't say it's important to plan to take it with science optional because we don't know if that's really going to be accepted the same way as scores with science. Next question is a fun one. What would you consider a strong test score? I will answer the question with the question. What do you consider a desirable college? Because, you know, your local state school and Harvard have different ideas on this point. So a strong test score is really dictated by what your goals are in this process. You can start by looking up the average scores at some schools that you're familiar with. That's a good way to kind of get a sense of what you might be interested in targeting in this process. Another question, if I prepared for ACT, what should I be doing to prepare for the PSAT? So there's really only one reason to prepare for the PSAT, and that would be if you have a chance to qualify for national merit. And how much preparation you should be doing for the PSAT would be dictated by your score on a practice SAT or PSAT and how close that is to what you'd eventually like to be scoring on the PSAT. But really the only reason is to potentially qualify for national merit, which varies quite a bit state by state, but it's usually around 1450 for the benchmark there. Alyssa, we got a question for you. What percentage of schools on your list should you visit?
So there are really let's say 2.5 major reasons to visit a school. The first may be very early on in your college process, visiting some local institutions, even if you are not sure if those institutions will be, necessarily schools that your child applies to, because it gives you a good sense of what kind of schools speak to your student. I'll occasionally tell students in our local Philadelphia area, if you go to visit Haverford College, it's a small liberal arts college, and you hate it, and you find it claustrophobic, you probably don't need to buy a plane ticket and fly to California to visit Claremont McKenna, because it's a small liberal arts college, and it's going to feel small and claustrophobic even if the weather might be better. So that is one reason. And that also extends to when you're starting to pin down a list to determine, more seriously, if your student is going to like a given school. Once you identify that you like the small liberal arts colleges, then maybe you do go visit Claremont McKenna, or maybe you do go visit Haverford. Strategically, though, the reason to visit a school is to determine if that school considers demonstrated interest in accepting or denying students. You can determine that by looking at the common data set. Jim's mentioned it already. It is a document that nearly every college and university releases that includes the factors that they consider in their application process and how heavily they weight them. Demonstrated interest is the amount of interest that a student has shown in a school. If a school considers demonstrated interest, visiting is a great way to show it, but it's not the only way to show it. If visiting a school is logistically or financially not feasible for you, you can attend virtual open houses, you can reach out to admissions officers, you can show up when the rep visits a high school or a local area. But those would be sort of the major reasons to visit a school.
And I would say even when a school considers demonstrated interest, they also consider distance, right? So if they're on the West Coast and you're on the East Coast, they're not holding you to the standard of, well, you didn't visit, the same way they would with a student in their own backyard. Okay, so next question. I saw the question, what if nothing bad or interesting happened to me, on one of the slides when talking about college essays, but I don't remember it being answered. So Alyssa, what if nothing bad or interesting happened to me?
Well, admissions officers are looking to get to know you and who you are as a person. They're not necessarily looking to hear a tragic or epic story from your past. And that's why we encourage students that their stories are enough. College admissions officers are people. They're looking to get to know who students are truly going to be on their campus. Are you going to be the person organizing, 11 p.m. trips to the soft serve place down the street? Or are you going to go to your classes, go back to your dorm, and then stare at TikTok for the rest of the evening? And that is what you hope to reveal in a personal statement, is those details, those insights, those moments of personality beyond, telling a sob story or recounting something impressive that may have happened on a resume. And I will speak to the fact that if there is something really bad that has happened or something really impressive that has happened, there are other places on the application to showcase that. The additional information section is a great place to discuss anything that may have affected a student's grades or extracurriculars, from something as small as, well, I, broke my ankle and that's why I didn't run track senior year, to, much more serious concerns. And to also recap on activities that are super impressive. Like if you have cured cancer, you maybe don't need to write your personal statement about it, but you should absolutely talk about the research that you did in your additional information section.
Well said. All right, next question. My son is registered for the SAT and it's been recommended that he actually take the ACT. Can we switch which test he will take even after we are registered, which is in December? Good question. So you would have to contact College Board directly about a refund. I don't know what their current refund policy is exactly. You can transfer registrations to different test dates within the same testing company. College Board and ACT are totally different entities though. So you can't transfer the registration, but you should be able to get your money back from College Board as long as you're far enough out from the registration deadline. So you get that refund from College Board and then you register for ACT and it's the same difference. Our final question for now, unless one comes in the next minute or so. Does every school have a common data set? The answer to that is no, not every school participates in the common data set, but the vast majority of them do. If there's one that you can't find, email our main company email address and just say, hey, can you help me find the common data set for this school? Probably one of us has looked at it pretty recently. So it should be relatively easy for one of us to track down for you if it exists, or we can tell you, hey, they don't post it. It's not, out there. Thank you all so much for attending tonight. If you have any further questions, I know the links to set up a further call with either of us are both in the QR codes on the screen and then also in the chat. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions about your students. And best of luck with the start of the school year to all the students who hung around this long. Take care, everybody. Good night.
Have a good night.